Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. I was raised to believe that a man's word was his bond, that if you shook hands on something, it meant more than any piece of paper ever could. That's how my father lived, and that's how I've lived every day since I was old enough to lace up my own boots. But trust is a fragile thing. Once it's broken, there's no putting it back the way it was. The morning sun stretched long shadows over the gravel driveway as I wiped the grease off my hands with an old rag. The shop had been busy all week, and I had spent most of the morning under the hood of a truck that had seen better days. I glanced up as Laura's old Chevy pulled in, dust kicking up behind tires. She killed the engine, stepped out, and gave me the sharp-eyed look that usually meant she had something on her mind. I leaned against the workbench, waiting. She shut the door and crossed her arms. Seen Jessica today? I wiped the back of my neck, shaking my head. Left early. School seminar. Some kind of training in Millfield. Laura exhaled slowly, like she was choosing her next words carefully. That what she told you? I frowned. Yeah. She shifted her weight, glancing around like she wanted to make sure no one else was listening. Then she said, I was in Millfield this morning. Didn't see any school seminar. That got my attention. I set the rag down, standing a little straighter. You sure? Laura nodded. Positive. I didn't say anything right away. Just let that sit between us for a moment. She sighed. Look, Cole, I don't want to stir up trouble where there ain't any, but something ain't adding up. She was right. I had noticed it too. Jessica had been leaving more often, always with an excuse. Seminars, school meetings, helping a friend, and the texts, constant, but never anything she wanted to show me. I had chalked it up to stress, to boredom, to whatever small-town restlessness had been creeping up on her lately. But Laura didn't speak on things unless she had a reason to. I finally nodded. I'll look into it. She studied me for a long moment. You let me know if you need anything. I met her gaze. I will. Laura nodded once, then climbed back in her truck, pulling away in a cloud of dust. I stood there for a minute, staring at the empty road. Jessica had told me she'd be home by 6. I checked my watch. It was nearly 7. The headlights swung into the driveway just before 8. Jessica stepped out, her purse slung over her shoulder, moving like she was in a rush to get inside. I was leaning against the porch railing, arms crossed. Long seminar? She paused, startled for a second, then gave me a quick smile. Yeah, we ran over. A bunch of teachers had questions. I nodded slowly, letting my gaze flick down to her phone, which was still in her hand. The screen lit up for a second before she quickly tilted it away from me, shoving it into her bag. I didn't move. That right? She let out a short laugh. Yes, Cole. You don't have to interrogate me every time I come home late. I didn't respond to that. Just watched her as she shifted on her feet, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. She cleared her throat. I'm going to grab a shower. She turned toward the door, but before she could go inside, I asked, Who were you texting? Jessica froze. It was slight, just a half-second delay before she glanced over her shoulder. What? I kept my voice calm. Your phone. Who keeps blowing it up? She blinked, then laughed like I was being ridiculous. Cole, it's just Alyssa. She's going through some stuff. I studied her. She was good. The words came easily, her tone casual. But her fingers twitched. Her breathing had changed, and she still hadn't met my eyes for more than a second. I nodded slowly. All right. Jessica hesitated like she wanted to say more, but instead, she gave a tight smile and disappeared inside. I stayed on the porch, staring out at the darkened road. She was lying to me. I didn't know about what yet, but I would. Laura didn't usually snoop. She wasn't the kind of woman who went digging for trouble where there wasn't any. But she also wasn't blind. Chris had always been a confident man, charismatic, good with words, the kind of guy who knew how to make people laugh. It was part of what had drawn her to him in the first place. But confidence could turn into something else if left unchecked. And tonight, as she walked past their bedroom, she caught a glimpse of something that made her stop. Chris was sitting on the bed, phone in hand, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He typed something, then chuckled softly to himself. Laura leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. Something funny? Chris glanced up, startled. Then, just as quickly, he relaxed, flashing that easy grin. Just messing around with a buddy from a gym. Laura raised an eyebrow. That right? He nodded, lifting his phone like it was proof. Just guy talk. But he was holding the screen at an angle, just barely tilted away from her. Laura stepped forward, quick and smooth, and before he could react, she snatched the phone from his hand. Damn it, Laura. She ignored him, her eyes scanning the messages. Flirty words, playful teasing, and at the top of the screen, the contact name, Jess. Her stomach clenched. Chris reached for the phone, but she took a step back. Who's Jess? His jaw tightened. Come on, don't start. Laura looked up slowly. Answer me. Chris ran a hand over his face. It's nothing. Just a joke. Her grip on the phone tightened. A joke. He let out an exasperated sigh. Yeah, Laura. It's harmless. She met his gaze, searching for any sign of honesty. But he held himself too casually, like he had already convinced himself that she was overreacting. Laura exhaled through her nose, then tossed the phone onto the bed. Better not be. Chris scoffed. You're really going to get worked up over this? She turned away, voice flat. I don't get worked up over nothing. Chris muttered something under his breath, but she didn't stick around to hear it. She walked out of the room, grabbing her keys off the counter. There was only one person she trusted to talk this through with. Cole was in the middle of fixing a fence post when Laura pulled up to the ranch. He glanced up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and immediately knew something was off. She climbed out of the truck, slamming the door harder than necessary. He raised an eyebrow. What's wrong? Laura crossed her arms. I need to ask you something. Cole waited. She exhaled sharply. Chris has been texting someone named Jess. His brows pulled together slightly. Jess? Laura nodded. He says it's just a joke, but the way he was acting, I don't know, Cole. It felt wrong. Cole ran a hand through his hair. Look, I get why you're upset, but Jessica goes by her full name. Nobody calls her Jess. Laura studied him for a long moment. You sure about that? Cole shrugged. Never heard anyone call her that before. Laura let out a slow breath. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's someone else. Cole placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Chris wouldn't do that to you. She searched his face, then sighed. I hope you're right. But even as she said it, something about the whole situation gnawed at her. Meanwhile, Alyssa had been picking up on something strange too. Jessica had always been a little restless, always craving something more than what their small town had to offer. But lately, it had been different. She had been skipping out on their usual coffee dates, avoiding the usual get-togethers. When Alyssa finally cornered her about it, Jessica just waved it off, laughing. I've just been exhausted. Alyssa frowned. Exhausted from what? Jessica's lips curved slightly. Let's just say I've been spending time with someone strong, someone who knows how to take charge. Alyssa's stomach twisted. Who? Jessica smirked, then shook her head. Doesn't matter. And that was the moment Alyssa knew something was seriously wrong. Cole didn't think much of Laura's concerns at first. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, especially about family. But then he started noticing things. Jessica had been skipping out on local events, always with an excuse. But he wasn't the only one disappearing. Chris had been gone at the same times. Coincidence? Cole wasn't sure, but he was about to find out. Laura never wanted to be right about this. She had spent the last few days telling herself it was all in her head, that maybe Chris was texting someone else, maybe Jessica's behavior had nothing to do with him. She wanted to believe it, but deep down she knew better. And today, she was about to get her answer. She had finished her ranch work earlier than usual and was heading home when she spotted something that made her pulse slow. Chris's truck, parked behind the old McAllister barn. There was no reason for it to be there. Chris had no business at this property. It belonged to a neighbor who had been out of town for weeks. Laura pulled off the road, killing the engine. She sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. And she stepped out of the truck. Her boots barely made a sound as she moved, years of working the land, making her steps careful and practiced. She approached the barn, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. And that's when she saw them. Chris, Jessica, locked together in the front seat of his truck, tangled up in each other like they had done this 100 times before. Laura stopped in her tracks, her stomach twisting violently. She should have marched over and ripped that damn door open. Should have dragged Jessica out by the hair and thrown Chris onto the dirt where he belonged. But she didn't, because if she did that, they'd have time to spin the story. Time to twist it into something it wasn't. No, she needed proof. Hands shaking, she pulled out her phone and snapped a few photos. The evidence was there. Jessica's hands in his hair, Chris's lips against her neck. Laura swallowed hard, stepping back slowly. She turned, walking back to her truck, willing herself not to break down. She had just caught her husband with her half-brother's wife. And now, she had to tell Cole. Cole was in the middle of replacing a carburetor when Laura stormed into the garage. He'd barely had time to wipe his hands before she shoved her phone into his chest. "Look at it." Cole frowned, glancing down at the screen. Then he stopped breathing. The picture said it all. Jessica, Chris, his wife, and his brother-in-law. Together. A long, slow silence stretched between them. Laura's voice was raw. "I didn't want to believe it. I swear to God, I didn't." Cole didn't move. Didn't blink. He just kept staring at the photos, his mind going eerily quiet. Laura watched him carefully. "Say something." He exhaled, setting the phone down on the workbench with a slow, deliberate motion. Then he turned to his half-sister. His voice was low, steady, dangerous. "Tell me everything." By the time Laura finished, her eyes were red, her hands trembling. "I didn't want to ruin your marriage, Cole." "But she's already done that." Cole flexed his fingers, forcing himself to breathe evenly. His marriage was dead. He just hadn't buried it yet. Laura leaned forward. "What are you going to do?" He lifted his head, looking her in the eyes. "I'm going to make them wish they never met." The garage smelled of oil and rust, the scent thick in the warm evening air. The metal workbench was cool under my hands as I gripped the edge, knuckles tight, mind burning with one singular thought. They had done this to me. Jessica, Chris, two people who should have been family. Two people who had thrown everything away. Laura stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching me carefully. She had seen a moment I snapped, when I clenched my jaw so tight it ached, when I punched the wall so hard the damn tools rattled on their hooks. "Easy, Cole," she said, voice low but firm. "Breaking your own garage ain't gonna fix this." I flexed my fingers, shaking out the sting in my knuckles. "You expect me to just stand here and let them get away with it?" "Of course not," she snapped. "But you can't go in blind, either. You're angry, and I get it. But we do this smart." I exhaled through my nose, dragging a hand down my face. "I don't just want her gone, Laura. I want her to regret every second of it." Laura's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Good. Then let's make it hurt." Laura had always been quick on her feet, the kind of person who didn't just react, she planned. That was why, as soon as I had agreed to play this the right way, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "We need backup," she muttered. "Someone who knows how Jessica moves, who can help us track the lies." I already knew where this was going. "Alyssa," I said. Laura nodded. "If anyone can confirm how long this has been going on, it's her." I wasn't thrilled about pulling in more people, but at this point, I needed information. Laura tapped out a message. Within minutes, Alyssa responded. "Meet me at the diner." Now, the diner was mostly empty when we walked in, just a few late-night stragglers nursing their coffees. Alyssa sat in a booth near the back, arms folded across her chest, lips pressed into a thin line. She looked pissed. She didn't even wait for us to sit before she spoke. "Tell me what the hell is going on." Laura slid into the seat across from her, and I followed. Alyssa glanced between us. "You sounded serious in the text." Laura didn't sugarcoat it. "Jessica is cheating." Alyssa blinked, then scoffed. "Yeah, I figured." I frowned. "What?" Alyssa shook her head, running a hand through her hair. "I knew she was sneaking around Cole. She was always canceling plans, acting weird. She talked about some man now and then, but I never knew who." She exhaled sharply. "I never thought it was Chris." Laura leaned forward. "So you suspected it?" Alyssa nodded. "I didn't have proof, but yeah." She started talking differently, acting more excited whenever she got a text. Kept saying she'd finally found someone who made her feel alive. She rolled her eyes. I thought she was being dramatic. I stared at the table, gripping the edge. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. Jessica had chosen this. Alyssa hesitated, then placed a hand on mine. Cole, I should have told you sooner. I shook my head. It's not your fault. Laura, however, wasn't interested in feelings. We need to hit them where it hurts, she said. Alyssa straightened. You have a plan? I looked up at them both. Not yet, I admitted. But I know one thing. Jessica and Chris don't get to walk away from this clean. Laura's gaze darkened. Good. Then let's figure out how to make them burn. For the next hour, we threw ideas back and forth. Laura wanted to confront them publicly, drag their names through the dirt in front of everyone. Alyssa was more subtle. She wanted to make them paranoid first, let them feel the walls closing in before exposing them completely. I listened, weighing the options, spying on them, gathering more proof, humiliating them at an event, or something rougher. I wasn't ruling anything out. But one thing was certain. By the time we were done, Jessica and Chris would wish they had never met. There are moments in a man's life when the blood runs hotter, when the air feels thick, charged with something dark and unrelenting. This was one of those moments. Jessica and Chris had made their choices. Now, it was time for them to face the consequences. The barn sat on an old stretch of land about 20 minutes outside town. It belonged to Laura's family, but nobody used it much anymore. Isolated, quiet. The perfect place for what we had planned. Laura leaned against her truck, scrolling through Jessica's phone. She had swiped it earlier, just long enough to send a single message before slipping it back into Jessica's bag. Chris thinks Jessica is setting up a special night for him, Laura said, a smirk playing at her lips. Alyssa let out a humorless laugh. That's the only way he'd show up. If he knew we were waiting, he'd run like the coward he is. I stood a few feet away, rolling a heavy wrench between my hands. I had used this same tool 100 times before, tightening bolts, fixing engines. Tonight, it had a different purpose. Laura snapped her phone shut. All right, we've got about an hour before they start sneaking around. I nodded. Let's get ready. The inside of the barn was dimly lit, just enough to create the illusion of warmth. A single lantern flickered near the far wall, throwing long shadows across the wooden beams. Alyssa had done her part, making the place look just romantic enough to sell the lie. A folded blanket in the center, a bottle of cheap wine set to the side. If Jessica walked in first, she wouldn't suspect a thing. But we weren't planning on giving her that luxury. Laura stood near the side exit, gripping the cattle prod she had pulled from the ranch. She tested the switch, a sharp buzz filling the air before she clicked it off again. Alyssa swallowed, glancing between us. We sure about this? Laura's expression hardened. They weren't worried about what they did to us. I adjusted my grip on the wrench. They wanted a secret hideaway. Let's give them one. We didn't have to wait long. Chris's truck rolled up first, headlights cutting through the night before he killed the engine. He stepped out casually, like he wasn't sneaking through someone else's land to meet his brother-in-law's wife. Laura tensed beside me, fingers tightening around the cattle prod. That bastard's really acting like this is just another night. I took a slow breath. Let him. Chris walked toward the barn, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. He reached for the handle, tugged it open, and stepped inside. Then the door slammed shut behind him. Chris barely had time to turn before I grabbed him by the collar, shoving him hard against the wooden post. The breath left his lungs in a single, stunned gasp. What the hell? I cut him off with a fist to the gut, his body folding in on itself. He wheezed, hands scrambling against my arms. Cole. Another punch, this time to the ribs. Chris groaned, slumping forward. I shoved it back against the post, my voice dangerously low. You really thought nobody would find out? Chris's hands trembled against my grip. A sharp crack cut through the air. Laura had just swung the cattle prod into the wood beside his head, electricity buzzing in the silence. Chris flinched. Laura's eyes were dark. Do you know how hard I had to stop myself from putting this straight through your damn chest? Chris swallowed hard. I tightened my hold on him, my voice steady. Jessica's on her way. You have about 5 minutes to decide how you want this to go down. Chris's breathing was ragged. What do you want? I leaned in. For you to understand exactly what it feels like to be powerless. I stepped back, letting him crumble to the floor. Laura didn't take her eyes off him as I turned to Alyssa. Is she close? I asked. Alyssa checked her phone, nodding. Just pulled off the main road. I exhaled, gripping the wrench tighter. Then let's welcome her. Jessica thought she was sneaky. She thought she had mastered the art of deception, of slipping away unnoticed, of weaving her lies so tightly that no one could unravel them. But tonight her time was up. The sound of her car approaching cut through the silence of the night. I stood in the shadows, gripping the wrench in my hand, my breath slow and measured. Across the barn, Laura stood poised near the post where Chris was already slumped, his face pale under the dim lantern light. Alyssa stayed near the entrance, phone ready, ensuring there was no escape. The plan was set. Jessica was about to walk into her reckoning. She stepped out her car, glancing around before slipping inside the barn. She moved carefully, like she was savoring the thrill of sneaking around, believing she had the night all to herself. Chris straightened when he saw her, forcing a smirk despite the bruises already forming on his ribs. "Took you long enough." Jessica laughed softly, stepping closer. Had to be sure Cole wasn't paying attention. Chris reached for her, his fingers brushing against her hip. "Well, he's not here, is he?" Jessica tilted her head, smirking. Not a clue in the world. Her voice echoed in the space, light and teasing. Then the barn door slammed shut. Jessica jumped, spinning around just as the lanterns flickered to life, casting long, shifting shadows across the wooden beams. And there we were, standing between her and any chance of escape. Laura cracked the cattle prod against the wooden post, sending a spark into the air. Chris flinched hard, eyes wide with pure, unfiltered panic. Alyssa locked the entrance behind her, holding up her phone. "Smile, Jessica. You're on camera." Jessica's breath hitched. "What is this?" I stepped forward, my voice low and steady. "It's the end of your damn games." Jessica's gaze darted between us, realization setting in like a slow, creeping fire. Chris tried to shift away, but Laura was on him in an instant, shoving him back down, the prod buzzing inches from his leg. "You move, you fry." He stilled, swallowing hard. Jessica's hands trembled. "Cole, baby." I grabbed her by the arm and yanked her down on her knees. "Don't you dare call me that." She gasped, trying to wrench away, but my grip tightened. "You destroyed my trust." My voice was cold, sharper than the edge of the wrench in my hand. Tears welled in her eyes. "Please, shut up," Laura snapped, her fury barely contained. She turned back to Chris, shaking her head. "You really thought you were untouchable." Chris, ever the coward, had nothing to say. He just stared at the cattle prod, sweat beading on his forehead. Alyssa stepped closer, her phone angled perfectly. "You might want to start explaining yourselves, because this is going to make for one hell of a story when it gets out." Jessica's breath came in short gasps now, her body shaking. "Cole, please don't." I let out a slow exhale, staring down at the woman I had once trusted with everything. "You don't get to beg." She had already made her choice. Now, it was time to face the consequences. The barn was thick with dust and tension, the kind of air that made it hard to breathe. The dim lanterns threw flickering shadows against the wooden beams, casting jagged silhouettes of everyone inside. Chris was against the post, his breathing uneven, his body rigid with fear. Laura stood in front of him, her grip tight on the cattle prod, eyes dark with fury. Jessica knelt in the dirt, her shoulders shaking, her wide eyes locked on me. For the first time, she understood. This wasn't a nightmare she could wake up from. This was real. Chris shifted slightly, testing his footing. Laura was on him in an instant, slamming him back against the post. The dull thud echoed through the barn as he groaned, his face contorting in pain. "Move again," Laura warned, pressing the prod just below his ribs. "I dare you." Chris winced. "Damn it, Laura." A sharp buzz cracked through the air as the prod lit up, stopping just short of his skin. He flinched violently, fear flashing across his face. "Shut up," Laura growled. Chris clenched his jaw, his breathing ragged. He'd spent years puffing out his chest, acting like the strongest guy in the room. But now, he was nothing. I turned my attention back to Jessica. She was shaking, her hands clutching the hem of her dress like she could shrink herself down. "Please, Cole," she whispered. I grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked her head back. She let out a sharp cry, her hands flying up to claw at mine. but I didn't let go. You don't get to beg. My voice was low, steady, lethal. Tears spilled down her face. I'm sorry, sorry. I snarled, tightening my grip. You're only sorry because you got caught. She sobbed harder, but I didn't care. You threw everything away, I hissed. For this. I shot a glance toward Chris, who was still pinned under Laura's glare. You wrecked our marriage for a man who would sell you out in a second to save his own damn skin. Jessica trembled, lips parted like she wanted to say something, but she had nothing left. No more lies. No more excuses. I let go of her hair, shoving her back. She landed hard in the dirt, her hands catching her fall. She was broken now. Good. Chris was still trying to play tough, spitting blood on the barn floor, his breaths uneven. Laura rolled her shoulders. You always thought you were smarter than everyone, didn't you? Chris didn't answer. Laura stepped closer, then, without warning, drove her fist into his ribs. A sickening grunt tore from his throat as he doubled over, only stopped by the thick wooden beam, keeping him upright. Not so smug now, are you? She muttered. Chris coughed, his head lolling forward. Laura grabbed a knife from her back pocket and turned toward the post, dragging the blade through the wood. Slow, deliberate. Jessica sobbed quietly, watching the X take shape. A warning, a final mark of what had happened here. When Laura finished, she turned back to Chris, leaning in close. If I ever catch you near me or my brother again, she let the threat hang in the air before stepping back, wiping the blade clean on her jeans. Chris let out a weak breath, nodding slightly. Coward. I reached down and grabbed Jessica's left hand. She gasped, flinching as I twisted the wedding ring off her finger. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. No, Cole, please. I tossed it into the hay without looking. You're nothing to me. She collapsed, body racked with sobs. I turned away. This was over. For her. For Chris. For all of it. Jessica stumbled out of the barn first, her hair tangled, dress torn, breath coming in ragged gasps. Her body shook as she clutched her bare hand, eyes wild as if she still couldn't believe what had happened. Chris limped behind her, his ribs throbbing with every step, face pale and drawn. He kept his head down, one arm wrapped around his midsection, knowing better than to look back. Neither of them spoke. Neither dared to. They had walked into that barn thinking they were untouchable. Now, they were nothing. Laura leaned against the wooden post, breathing deep, staring after them with cold satisfaction. Think they learned their lesson? I watched as Jessica tripped over a loose rock, barely catching herself before scrambling toward her car. Chris moved slower, wincing with every step. They'll never forget it. Alyssa exhaled, locking her phone screen. Should we be worried about them running to the cops? Laura let out a sharp laugh. What are they going to say? That we roughed them up for cheating? They'd have to admit everything first. I nodded. They won't risk it. They'll just run. And they did. Jessica's tires spun against the dirt as she sped away, tail lights disappearing down the road. Chris lingered only a moment longer before dragging himself into his own truck and following. Then they were gone. And that was that. By the next morning, the first whispers had already begun to spread. Jessica had shown up at home in the dead of night, her dress ripped, her face streaked with tears. She barely had time to throw a few things into a suitcase before driving off again, too humiliated to face the town. Chris? He had vanished too. Some said he was hiding out at a friend's place, licking his wounds. Others claimed he was skipping town altogether, running from the inevitable fallout. But the damage was already done. Word spread fast in a place like this. And people talked. By midday, I was standing in my lawyer's office, finalizing the divorce. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a fight. Jessica had no leverage. The prenup had made sure of that. Everything, our house, our savings, even the damn furniture, stayed with me. She was leaving with nothing but whatever she could fit in her suitcase. And I didn't lose a second of sleep over it. Amelia sat beside me, arms crossed, nodding approvingly as I signed the final papers. That's it. I set the pen down. That's it. She smirked. Well, that was easier than I thought. I exhaled, standing. She made it easy. The house felt different that night. Quieter. Lighter. Jessica's things were gone. Her presence erased. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel stuck. Later that evening, Melanie stopped by. She had heard what happened. Everyone had. She didn't say much at first, just handed me a cold beer and sat beside me on the porch, staring out at the darkened fields. "You all right?" she finally asked. I took a slow sip, nodding. "Yeah." She studied me for a long moment. "You don't have to be." I let out a dry chuckle. "I know." Silence stretched between us, comfortable, easy. Then, after a moment, she said, "I never liked her, you know." I turned my head slightly. "Yeah." Melanie smirked. "She was never good enough for you." I didn't respond right away, just let her words settle. For the first time, I believed them. Jessica was gone. Jessica had nothing left. No house, no money, no friends. By the time she packed her last suitcase, the town had already turned its back on her. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman who betrayed her husband with his own brother-in-law. Nobody cared about her excuses, her tears, her pathetic attempts to twist the story. By the time she pulled out of the driveway, she was nothing but a bad memory. And I wasn't wasting another second thinking about her. Chris had fled before the sun even came up. Laura had made sure of that. After what happened in the barn, he must have realized there was nothing left for him here. He didn't even try to patch things up with my sister. Not that she would have let him. Laura had already thrown his things out before he had a chance to come crawling back. He didn't fight it. He just disappeared. Some folks said he was heading west, trying to start fresh where no one knew his name. Others claimed he was bunking with distant relatives, too ashamed to show his face. I didn't care. Let him rot somewhere far away. With them both gone, the town settled back into itself. It was strange at first, like the air had cleared, like I could finally breathe again. But I wasn't alone. Laura made sure of that. She stopped by more often, bringing dinner when she knew I wouldn't bother cooking, dragging me out for a drink when I spent too much time alone. One night, she leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "You doing all right?" I nodded. "Yeah." She studied me for a long moment. "You don't regret what we did, do you?" I met her gaze. "Do you?" She smirked. "Not even a little." I let out a slow breath. "Then neither do I." She nodded, satisfied. "Good." Alyssa was there too. She had been there from the start, standing beside me when everything fell apart, never once looking away when things got ugly. She was the only one who had tried to warn me, the only one who saw through Jessica's lies before I did. And now, she was still here. She stopped by one evening after work, bringing a six-pack and a quiet smile. We sat on the porch, the old wooden steps creaking under our weight, the night air warm and thick with the scent of wild grass. Neither of us spoke at first. Then, after a long moment, she said, "I hate what she did to you." I nodded. "Me too." She hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of her bottle. "You deserve better, Cole." I turned my head slightly, studying her. "Yeah." She met my gaze, something softer in her expression. "Yeah." Silence stretched between us, something unspoken settling in the space where pain used to be. Then, without thinking, I reached out. Alyssa did the same. Our hands met in the middle, fingers brushing, then locking together. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. Jessica was gone. Chris was gone. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. To something real. To something worth holding on to. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like, and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.